Hello ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for tuning into this tutorial from historychappy.com on militancy and black nationalism during the civil rights era of 1945 to 1975. Okay, we'll take you through some of the bits and bobs that happened and some of the bits and bobs you might need to know if you're following the Edexcel GCSE or IGCSE on this topic, or even an A-level. So there we go. Now, in the early 1960s, the trend is largely that militancy within the civil rights movement is quite low. Figures like Martin Luther King, groups like the NAACP, the MIA, and the SNCC are largely non-violent and are willing to use methods and means like non-violent direct action to achieve civil rights, work through the law, work with whites to obtain equality. As the 1960s progresses and progression in the civil rights movement or for black people towards civil rights does not seem to be happening quick enough, and groups and individuals arrive that espouse a more direct and maybe more militant or violent route to achieving civil rights and equality comes along, militancy rises throughout the mid to late 1960s. Okay, so what's it all about then, peaceful versus militancy? Well, it's all about really how you want to achieve your goals and how best to get what you want. Martin Luther King and the MIA and NAACP would probably have argued if you work inclusively, by including everybody and peacefully within the laws of the system, that's probably the best way to change the system, even though it might take a bit of time. On the other hand, you might have some people that say working within the system, playing by the rules, is not the best way to go. The best way to go about things is to work exclusively with an elite core or with a certain group of people, in this case maybe just black people, and or militantly, not always within the laws of the system, is maybe a better way to change the system, or maybe changing the system isn't what you're after. Maybe you want to reject the system and set up your own one. In the case of the Black Panthers, it would be setting up their own healthcare and educational facilities. In the case of the Nation of Islam, creating their own separate state. So different means and occasionally different goals as well between the peaceful, more militant movements. Working inclusively, here are some individuals and groups that would maybe have adhered to that. So MLK, the NAACP, Ralph Abernathy, and the Montgomery Improvement Association. There's some of those groups and individuals that might espouse that. What might they do then in order to achieve or work towards civil rights for black Americans? Well, these are some of the things that they might do. You've got freedom rides, court cases, so things like Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, undertaking sit-ins, lobbying the government to change legislation, to pass legislation to make inclusivity legal, with things like the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Protest marches, and you could almost add to that, I would argue, the Montgomery bus boycott as well in 1956. So have a little think about the advantages and disadvantages of working peacefully within the system and inclusively to change the system. On the other hand, you could work exclusively, and by that I mean maybe not including everybody in your goal, whatever that may be, and militantly, not within the laws of the system. Here are some of the individuals and groups that might seek to do that. Carmichael Newton Seal, Malcolm X before his assassination, and the Black Panthers, and also the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who after 1966 are less inclusive of white people within their group and become more militant. These are some of the things that they may do in order to achieve their goals. Just remember, as the 1960s goes on, the more militant wing becomes more popular relatively. Okay then, why use militancy? Well, frustration with the system. If it's not changing quick enough and you perceive it to be unfair or unrepresentative, you might get frustrated and be more inclined to be militant. If the peaceful way is going slowly or is perceived to be going slowly, that might increase the amount of people willing to try militancy, which is maybe what happened in the 1960s. We know if you try and work through the law to change the law, it's going to take time and you're not going to get instant results. That can cause people to become disillusioned and disheartened with the peaceful methods and be more inclined to choose a more militant way forward. If you're experiencing racism, or you perceive yourself to be experiencing racism and poor conditions with educational facilities, healthcare facilities, all the while the civil rights movement is trying to change that peacefully, all the while those same people that are experiencing those negative conditions or poor conditions are still expected to live with those poor conditions. And it's very difficult to ask those people just to put their feelings on hold and wait for change to come. They can become disheartened and impatient if progress is perceived to be slow. Just think, would you be willing to be peaceful and inclusive if you felt you were treated badly? Would you be willing to wait for change to come eventually? Maybe, maybe not. I suppose it depends on what type of person you are. So where does the sort of black militancy start? Well, we could maybe trace it back to Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s. It maybe appealed to lower and working class black people, and it demanded definitely separation rather than integration. With things like the Back to Africa movement. Its idea was similar to the Black Panthers, I suppose, and maybe with the Nation of Islam also, the idea of not advising black people to be reliant on white people for facilities or for the deliverance of equality. Do for self, to make black people self-sufficient, so maybe they don't have to experience the racism of whites. It was the opposite to what the NAACP at the time were offering in the 1920s with W.B. Du Bois, which mainly, I would suggest, maybe appealed to the more middle-class black people. But who knows? That's for you to research. So where does the Nation of Islam come in? Well, the man that founded it is this man, Wallace Fard Muhammad. He is a genuine historical mystery. The Nation of Islam claim he is the Mahdi or Messiah or God in person, or Allah incarnate. We don't necessarily factually know who he actually was. We don't know where he came from. We don't necessarily know exactly what he did, and we don't know where he went either. He disappears off the face of the earth in 1933. But all you need to know is that for the Nation of Islam, they believe that he is God, and he preached a sort of do-for-self religious doctrine, which became the Nation of Islam's philosophy. As we've said, they insist that this gentleman is God incarnate, with a mission to deliver Islam or his own version of Islam to the blacks of America. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, incidentally insist he was a known criminal called Wallace Ford. What you want to believe is completely up to you. If you want to research it further, please do. Okay. Just remember, the Nation of Islam are not a civil rights organisation. They are an apolitical, so they are not political, religious organisation that demanded total separation from white America. And this gentleman, Elijah Muhammad, becomes the unquestioned leader and styled himself or claimed to be God's messenger until his death in 1975. It was an exclusive organisation. Only black Americans could be a part of it. As we've said, they were not a civil rights organisation. Elijah Muhammad actively forbade his members to become involved in the civil rights movement. Instead, members of the Nation of Islam were encouraged to believe that freedom for blacks could never be achieved alongside white people who the Nation of Islam claimed were devils in human form. Therefore, they followed Elijah's religious instruction and demanded a state of their own within America, a Nation of Islam. Some people claim they were violent. I have no evidence of that, apart from maybe the assassination of Malcolm X, but they did not use violence in the civil rights movement. They weren't a part of the civil rights movement. They were non-political. They were a religious organisation. Why are they important? Well, they encouraged black self-pride. They were one of the first groups to reject white America. They were definitely a counterweight and vocal alternative to Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. They brought the idea of black nationalism to international consciousness, and they had two very, very important members, Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, who I'm sure you've heard of, so very, very influential clientele. They did have a limited appeal, though, the Nation of Islam. They were by no means universally accepted by black Americans. Here we have some quotes from Elijah Muhammad in his book Message to the Black Man, which talk about God, their relationship to whites. I will let you make your own mind up about that. But this quote here probably sums up the Nation of Islam. It says, "The Bible and Quran are full of teachings of this bloody race of devils. They shed the lifeblood of all life, even their own, and they're scientists at deceiving the black people." That's probably their doctrine. They were against inclusion with or interaction with whites. Despite their limited appeal, though, they did prove very, very popular because Malcolm X was such a great spokesman. But the vast majority of black people completely ignored the Nation of Islam and found them a little bit odd, but what you want to think is completely your opinion. Malcolm X was obviously a high-ranking member of the nation until he split with them in 1964. He was an excellent, highly charismatic speaker. He believed that teaching people to be non-violent, as did Martin Luther King in the face of violence, was completely irresponsible. He falls out with Elijah Muhammad over the Nation of Islam's refusal to allow him to become involved in the civil rights movement, or to allow him to voice an opinion on that. So he leaves the Nation of Islam in 1964 and establishes the Organisation of Afro-American Unity, which was a non-religious, secular civil rights group that campaigned for civil rights for black people. After he left the Nation of Islam, he becomes more willing to work with other civil rights leaders, but was still quite militant in his outlook, methods and philosophy. After Malcolm died, a group called the Black Panthers was set up. Now, the Black Panthers was not established by Malcolm. Malcolm had nothing to do with them. So Malcolm's main influence was, quote, and it's not my quote, was an intellectual impact. He encouraged the idea of black self-sufficiency and black militancy within the civil rights movement, of which the Black Panthers manifested and embodied. They were another small but significant secular party established by Huey Newton and Bobby Neal in 1966. They had a 10-point plan, which, similar to the UNIA and Nation of Islam, advocated self-reliance and self-sufficiency, autarky within the black community. They were slightly different from the Nation of Islam and definitely from Martin Luther King's side of the movement because they carried guns and dressed in military attire, which got them lots of attention in the media, as you can imagine. From 1965 onwards, in many northern towns and cities, there were race riots. Detroit in 1967 and Cleveland in 1968 being two such examples. They were not organised by any particular group. They were sometimes and mainly triggered by police brutality or suspected police brutality that ignited the underlying socio-economic tensions, such as poor housing and services, which we discussed earlier. And here we have a quote about Black Power. It didn't cause the riots, that's for sure, but it might have helped, fuel them or fuel the discontent or provide an outlet for some of that discontent. But the riots themselves coincided with Black Power. It wasn't caused by it, okay? And here we have the summary, really. As the 1960s progresses, the civil rights movement lost MLK after his assassination in 1968, who was its probably most notable proponent. The race riots caused the civil rights movement, to become less respectable in the eyes of many Americans. Plus, there were other issues by that point that were competing with the civil rights movement for people's attention and the government's attention. So if we flick back, all we need to remember is, if we're going to remember nothing else, here we go. At the start of the 60s, militancy is low. By the end of the 60s, militancy is high. I hope you enjoyed that. If you like that tutorial, please listen to many others at www.historychappy.com. Thank you very, very much, and goodbye.